There was a strange story reported in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in November of 1894. Captain Joseph Sims of the schooner named Maribel told this story after the vessel had arrived from Matanzas, Cuba. On board for that particular voyage was a crew of 30 sailors, mostly Englishmen. However, they were all new faces to the port of Philadelphia and unknown to the local seafaring community. Questions were raised about their identities and the extent of their experience as seafaring men. Captain Sims admitted that there was no way of knowing their worth until they had taken to the high seas, but he was glad he'd taken them on, because they all proved to be worthy sailors. This is the story he told at the port immediately after the Maribel had arrived in Philadelphia. However, when later approached by a reporter, he gave another story. After the Maribel had set sail from Philadelphia for Cuba on January 20th, 1894, Captain Sims said that he quickly noticed that one of his crew, a man named Bilson, was clearly addicted to drink, more so than usual, but he still somehow managed to work alongside the best of them. Regardless of his work ethic, as time went on and the drinking continued, the captain took Bilson aside and asked him to, at the very least, reduce his intake while working. Slightly embarrassed, the sailor was polite in his reply and promised Sims that he would give up altogether. Captain Sims reportedly said the following: "He did not drink anything the next day, but it was hard on him and I felt sorry for the poor fellow. He was on watch that night from midnight until daylight. The last thing I said to him was, 'Remember, Bilson, about the liquor,' to which he replied that I need not fear." It was 2 hours into Bilson's watch when the captain heard a tremendous crash on deck. Sims ran to find a number of his crew holding Bilson back from the edge of the vessel. He was trying to throw himself overboard. In his shipmates' opinion, Bilson was suffering from delirium after breaking his promise and hitting the booze harder than he had before. After a struggle that saw the maddened Bilson overpower a number of his shipmates, he was finally incapacitated, put in chains and placed on deck. As the night drew on, he was heard screaming for hours to be let out of his confines. Now it was said that during that night, Bilson had managed to escape and again tried to jump overboard. That was the story told by the sailors who claimed to have stopped him. Whatever really came to pass that night was never fully understood, but crewmate Bilson died during the struggle. His drunken delirium was blamed for his passing, his body was wrapped in sheets, and he was thrown into the North Atlantic. 2 nights later, a member of the ship's crew knocked on the captain's door, exclaiming that he had just seen Bilson at the stern of the boat. He said he was sat on a coil of rope looking out to sea. Captain Sims laughed, told the man that he himself had obviously been drinking, either that or he'd been dreaming. The desperate sailor insisted that Sims accompany him to the upper deck. Joseph Sims told the Philadelphia reporter that what he saw left him dumbfounded. There, he said, quite clearly, was Sailor Bilson, sat with his head held high looking out to sea. Sims said he called to him but got no reply. He then walked to Bilson's side, but by the time he got there was nothing but a pile of rope. The apparition, according to Sims, appeared that night and every night thereafter, at the same hour until the day they anchored in Cuba. On the final night before they arrived in Matanzas, Bilson appeared one more time. He pointed towards the city as they approached, stood up and calmly walked off the side of the Maribel. On arriving in Cuba, every member of the boat's crew left and refused to board her again. As captain, Joseph Sims had no choice but to see the Maribel's safe return to Philadelphia, but for this, he would need a new crew. In 1934, British author E.M. Delafield contacted the Devon-based newspaper The Western Morning News to tell them that an old friend of hers, who was a member of an Arctic expedition in 1876 on board HMS Pandora, wanted to share a story with them. A story that he rarely told over the years, but seeing as, at 84 years old, he was the last surviving member of the expedition, he felt it should be recorded. Mr. W.J.A. Grant was his name. He was the expedition's photographer and the youngest member of the crew. This is his story. In 1875, the British government sent 2 ships to the Arctic. HMS Alert and HMS Discovery. The ship set sail from Portsmouth on May 29, 1875, in an attempt to reach the North Pole via Smith Sound. The mission ultimately failed, as they found the route impassable due to ice, forcing both ships to turn around. Meanwhile, another ship, HMS Pandora, which would later be known as SS Jeannette, was on its own mission to find the remains of Sir John Franklin, a Royal Naval officer whose ship became trapped in ice in 1845 off of King William Island, Canada. The Pandora's mission to find John Franklin, which, if successful, carried a reward of £20,000, was one of many in a decade-long search effort which included ships from both Britain and the USA. HMS Pandora's crew, eager to make it to the treacherous Northwest Passage safely, were begged by the British government to attempt to make contact with HMS Discovery and HMS Alert, and to aid the ships if possible. The owner of the Pandora, Sir Alan Young, was paid £4,000 to make the detour. The Pandora made it as far as Melville Bay, Greenland, before almost being crushed by ice. Unable to go any further north, the crew sailed to Disco Island. The governor of the island welcomed the men and were given leave to go ashore. However, one doctor and his assistant remained on board. After a few days, they left Disco Island and were homeward bound, heading in the direction of Cape Farewell, the southernmost point of Greenland. Our storyteller, W.J.A. Grant, as mentioned, was the official photographer on board. A small storage space next to the ship's engine room was made into a darkroom for him. An iron ventilation shaft rose from the darkroom to the upper deck. One night, an engineer on the Pandora went down to the engine room to fetch some tools. When he returned, he was said to be in a fearful state, swearing that he had heard screams of a woman coming from Mr. Grant's darkroom. "Rubbish," his crewmates exclaimed. As the man who claimed to have heard the screams was known to be partially deaf, he was the butt of many a joke that night. The next day, due to heavy winds, progress became extremely slow as they moved towards Cape Farewell. As darkness drew in once again, Grant was on night watch with a Dutchman named Koeleman from midnight until 4 a.m. Towards the end of their shift, Grant and his companion passed by the ventilation shaft and heard the clear, high-pitched screams of a woman from within the engine room come darkroom. Koeleman exclaimed that it must have been the woman the engineer was talking about. Neither man ventured down into the engine room during those early hours of the morning, but when the sun came up, the incident was reported, and a crew member was sent down to investigate. There were no signs of life in the dark engine room, but at the far end of the room, hidden in the shadows, was a sealed wooden box marked Surgical Apparatus. The box, which had never been seen before, was brought up to the deck and prized open. Inside it were the dismembered, partially frozen remains of a woman. Her head, arms and legs had been cleanly sawn off. No one present on deck knew, or at least would admit to knowing, what the remains were doing on board the Pandora. At a loss for an explanation, and bewildered at the gory discovery, the men hastily organised a funeral, and the body was consigned to the waves. From that moment on, Mr. Grant says the wind shifted, and in a short while the Pandora had passed Greenland and began making good progress towards her destination, Bantry Bay in Ireland, where the crew eventually landed safely. So what was the explanation for the dismembered woman found on HMS Pandora? Well, the young doctor, who said he would remain on board, was actually paid £100 by the London Anthropological Society to bring back the remains of a person indigenous to the Arctic region. When the rest of the crew were on leave from the ship, the doctor and his assistant went to a burial site on Disco Island. As the ground there was frozen and too hard to bury the dead, they were placed on top of it in a casket which was covered with ice and rocks. The doctor found the casket and cut the body into pieces. The parts were then placed in a smaller box labelled Surgical Apparatus and secretly brought aboard the Pandora. The doctor did not make his secret known until he had returned to London. It was 1965 when experienced diver Eric Buchanan took to the water at Sydney Harbour in Port Jackson Bay. Wearing a bulky diving suit, he was there to inspect some underwater cables which had recently been laid close to Sydney Harbour Bridge. He was working alone, but had voice contact with the crew of the boat above. As he slowly made his way along one of the cables, he felt the unmistakable thumping vibration of someone else walking along or stepping onto the cable. He called up to the vessel above and asked which diver had joined him and why. They told him he was alone, but he said he was sure that another diver was down there with him, but they insisted he was alone. Eric looked ahead into the sunlit water and saw what he described as the unmistakable, perfect silhouette of a hard-hatted diver stepping off of the cable and slowly making their way to the west. When Eric rose to the surface and explained what he'd seen, everyone laughed and said he'd obviously been down there for too long, but he knew that if there was another diver in the area, they would definitely need a boat, but Eric and his crew had the only diving vessel in the area. The incident stayed with Eric Buchanan, and over time he discounted all of the logical explanations. He also noticed that there was no mud cloud in the wake of the walking diver, and there were no air bubbles as he moved. The following day, a friend of Eric's, a fellow diver, had an almost identical experience in the same location. Eric suggested in a 1996 Australian documentary called Ghost Files that the answer may lie back in the 1920s and 30s. A number of men lost their lives during the construction of Sydney Harbour Bridge. One of them was a hard-hatted diver. There was a third, very similar report given by a diver who claims to have seen the same apparition in the early 1990s. Built in Dumbarton, Scotland in 1865, the Duke of Atholl, later known as Carla, was a full-rigged ship which sailed frequently between Britain, Australia and the USA. On August 1, 1876, fully loaded with coal, she set sail from Sydney Harbour destined for San Francisco. On board the ship was former US military man Tom Manning. On the evening of October 17th, as the Duke of Atholl was nearing San Francisco, Tom Manning was given the job as lookout between the hours of 8 and 10 p.m. At around 20 minutes past 9, there was a loud scream and a thud heard coming from the front section of the ship, known as the forecastle. Tom Manning then came running across the deck shouting incoherently. The crew rushed to his aid, took hold of Manning and brought him down to the lower deck. His speech was disjointed and rambled, apart from the name Johnny, something he kept repeating. His fellow crew fetched Manning some alcohol, which he gladly accepted. After a few minutes he began to calm down, and relayed the experience that had caused him so much anguish. While on lookout he had been disturbed by a creaking and thudding of wood towards the bow of the ship. When he turned and looked out into the dark horizon, he saw a figure climbing over the bow. The man, who looked as if he had come from the sea itself, stepped onto the deck and beckoned Tom to come forward. He then stepped forward himself, looked Manning in the eye and said, "Goodbye, Tom. I shan't see you again." To Manning's horror, he recognised the man as his brother John, who then turned around, silently walked to the ship's edge and dropped down, apparently into the ocean, but there was no sound. Tom then turned, bounded off the forecastle and ran towards the stern, which is where his crewmates found him. 2 days later, on October 19th, the Duke of Atholl dropped anchor in the harbour at San Francisco at 9:30 a.m. Manning requested a brief leave from the ship, which was granted without hesitation. Now Tom Manning had a brother named John, who he hadn't seen for a good 5 years. John Manning ran a sailor's boarding house near Jackson Street, San Francisco. Following his traumatic experience 2 nights earlier, and absolutely convinced that he had seen the apparition of his estranged brother at sea, Tom was desperate to make contact. Having no idea of his brother's condition previously, but now sure he was gravely ill at best, Tom approached his brother's front door with a great deal of trepidation and a heavy heart. The wife of his brother answered the door, and, as if expecting him, said, "Oh Tom, you've come too late. John died the night before last." For this next tale, we move inland slightly. Now, one of the things I normally like to do at the beginning of any story is to establish exactly when and where in the world it is set. Frustratingly, in this case, no definite location is given, but the story was printed in the local newspapers of Yorkshire towns Tadcaster and Otley in December of 1873, and was described as happening, quote, a few years ago in one of our seashore resorts. Going on this information, it's fair to assume that the story's origin lies in the British Isles, sometime in the mid to late 19th century. That being said, I'll begin. A young woman looking for a summer home by the sea for herself, her sister and her children was offered an old, slightly run-down house at a very reasonable price. The house, although old, was comfortable, and after just a few weeks the family were well settled in their new summer home. As the weeks passed, they made the most of their time there, enjoyed the beach and walks on the coast, all the time blissfully unaware of the house's dark past. One evening the young son of the woman, who was described as a bright little boy, called out to his mother during the night. In a frantic state, he asked his mother to tell the lady to leave his room. "I don't know who she is," he said, "and I can't see her face, but she stands near my bed and she frightens me." His mother, being a pragmatic woman, didn't take his claims seriously and put them down to nightmares, but she told him that if it happened again to join her in her bed. A few nights later, the boy ran into his mother's bedroom, exclaiming that the woman had returned. So afraid was the young man that from that night on, he shared his mother's room. It was on one particularly hot July day that the boy's aunt, as she was seated by the parlour window, exclaimed that she was far too hot. At that moment, a voice from beyond the nearby cellar door replied, "And I am cold." Pausing and contemplating for a moment about what she had heard, she turned to the cellar door. She knew no one was down there. In fact, the family rarely ventured into the cellar at all, and besides, the door was locked. She called out, and getting no reply, she unlocked the door and made a quick search of the cellar, and as she had thought, no one was there. Now, the lady of the house, despite the disturbances her son had experienced, and the outlandish claims of her sister that an unseen presence occupied the cellar, refused to accept any notion of a supernatural presence, putting them down to nightmares, daydreams, or even complete fabrication. That being said, her next move was at odds with her beliefs. She invited a local priest to the house to investigate the family's claims. She said that this was in order to prove to the household that there were no evil spirits or ghosts. When the priest arrived, he was given the boy's old room. After the first night, the lady of the house awoke and went to the priest's room. On entering the room, she found him slumped on the sofa, sweating profusely and looking as if he had had a sleepless night. In answer to her anxious questions, he said that he had fallen into a deep slumber, but was woken by the presence of a woman in black, stood beside his bed. Her face, he said, was completely covered by a large black bonnet. Unalarmed at first, thinking it was a servant who had come to see if he was comfortable, he spoke to her. Only 2 points were raised in the news article regarding the alleged conversation the priest had with the apparition. Firstly, he said that she told him to search for her in the cellar. When asked why she wore a black bonnet, she said that the lime had spoilt her face. The lady of the house then requested that the clergyman accompany her to the cellar. They searched the underground space and discovered a small area of paved slabs that looked as if they had at some point been hastily torn up and put back into place. After suitable tools for the job were obtained, they raised the paving slabs and dug beneath them. When they did, a mass of quick lime was pulled from the earth, and within that lime were large pieces of bone. When a medical examiner confirmed that the bones were human, they were carefully removed, placed in a wooden box, and interred at the cemetery in a neighbouring town. The article claims that a subsequent investigation into the history of the old house revealed that it had originally been occupied by a retired sea captain and his only son, the latter being a, quote, wild and reckless youth of evil character. The men employed a young girl as a servant, and for a while she appeared content, but soon became outwardly unhappy, and was seen by neighbours to be in tears much of the time. When one day she disappeared, it was claimed by her employers that she had gone to visit friends, but she never did return, and suspicion immediately fell on the old man and his son, who themselves, before they could be confronted, left the premises and locked it up. And that's how the house remained for years. Imagination could conjure up many scenarios of how the bones came to be there. If the story is in fact true, Common sense tells us that the young woman met a horrible end within the house at the hands of the men who employed her, and was then buried within the cellar. But I could find no confirmation of any of it, and like so many of these types of stories, it will have to be cast into the realms of lore. Higby Beach in Cape May, New Jersey, is situated on the southern peninsula of the state, south of Cape May Canal. According to historians, the beach was once part of Cape May's early farmland, and on that land was a tavern owned by Thomas and Rhoda Forrest between 1807 and 1823. The tavern, which stood 200 yards from the beach, in the location which is now the beach's parking lot, became the Hermitage Hotel and was owned by brothers Joseph and Thomas Higby. The brothers, who extended the building and operated the hotel for many years, lived in a separate house on Bayshore Road close to the beach, but a lantern was always kept in the top window of the hotel, alerting passing vessels when rooms were available. Joseph Higby passed away in 1872, and 7 years later, in 1879, so did his brother Thomas. Thomas Higby left his entire estate to a woman believed to be his niece, named Etta Gregory. One condition of Thomas Higby's last will and testament was that he be buried close to his beloved hotel. He also specified that he wanted his grave to be lined with brick and flagstone, and then covered with a large inscribed marble slab. His request was carried out, but he wasn't allowed to rest in everlasting peace, for 58 years later, in 1937, Etta Gregory passed away, and it was her last will that Thomas Higby be disinterred and buried beside her at her chosen site, the Gregory family plot at Cold Spring Cemetery, 3.5 miles northeast of Higby Beach. She also specified, possibly to make up for the intrusion, that his new grave was to be filled with sand from the beach. The hotel was demolished in 1940, 3 years after Etta's death. Some believe that the demolition of his beloved hotel, along with the removal of his body from his chosen resting place, has caused Thomas Higby to return, for since 1937 there have been numerous sightings of a male apparition in a dark coat walking the beach at dusk, sometimes with a large dog, often taking the same short route and vanishing at the same point each time. Some are sure that the apparition is what remains of Thomas Higby, and the point at which he vanishes is the location of his chosen resting place, where he was buried for almost 60 years. The gravesite that Thomas Higby now shares with Etta Gregory can be found at the Cold Spring Presbyterian Church Cemetery on Seashore Road, Cape May, 3.5 miles northeast of Higby Beach.